Hello everyone, welcome to WealthSpire Winter 2024 Market Recap and Outlook. I am Dmitriy Katsnelson, Deputy CIO here at WealthSpire, and I'm joined by Chris Maxey, our Chief Market Strategist. So Chris, 2022 was a rough year on many accounts, and there were a lot of questions coming in to 2023. Why don't you walk through some of the things that happened and didn't really happen last year?
Sure. So there was a widespread expectation as we look at 2023 that we were going to have a recession. So if you go back to December of 2022, about 60 to 70% of economists in this country were predicting that we would have a recession within the next 12 months. And that recession was a function of Federal Reserve trying to raise interest rates in order to bring inflation down, and the outcome of that being a consumer that was not going to be as willing to spend. What we actually saw is that didn't happen, right? Economists wound up not being correct on that account. Forecasting, as we know, is a very hard thing to do. The economy remained resilient. Real GDP grew throughout the course of the year. Consumers continued to show strength. The labor force grew by nearly 3 million jobs. So as we look at 2023, right, there were a number of positive things that continued to unfold, at least in terms of economic terms. The one thing that was a bit of a wild card last year was the banking sector, right? We had bank failures in the US, we had a very large bank failure overseas, and we still don't know the full implications and ramifications of what that's going to mean for the economy. We certainly have some ideas that it might lead to less credit growth, and perhaps that's going to contribute to a further slowdown in economic activity. But overall, 2023 wound up being a good year. So, Dmitry, the economy did okay last year, but there were still many people quite worried about stocks, bonds, other risk assets. So what do we see happening in the stock market and within the bond market?
Just to remind folks, 2022 was a rough year. It was the rough year for stocks, even rougher for bonds. We had the worst bond market in the history of the US, effectively. So when you have your core fixed income down in excess of 10%, that's a very rough way to start. Obviously, 2023 brought a reprieve there. So equity markets were up both in the US and abroad, large caps in particular, which we'll touch on in a second. But the bond market actually avoided its third consecutive down year, which was important, right? We haven't had that in a while, especially to the degree that we saw in 2022. So we saw it was the interest rate pause at the end of the year when the Fed came out in late October and said, you know what, we're going to pause this hiking cycle. That really was the start of a rally in bonds, rally in the rest of the stock market. Up until that point, the things that were really working was the mega cap growthy US stuff, right? The Magnificent Seven, which is an odd naming if you've ever seen the movie, but those stocks were really driving returns for much of the year until the end of October into November. And even so, with everything else rebounding, those stocks were up 100+% this year. I think the market cap, you were talking about it the other day, $4.5 trillion of market cap appreciation in 2023 alone for those 7 stocks. That's more than the entirety of the US small cap market. So you had an appreciation in 1 year greater than the entire market cap of US small cap space. So obviously a very resounding rebound there. A lot of that was driven by this kind of assumption of AI adjacency. AI was a big story in 2023, and if you were in a company that had software or hardware even remotely tied to it, it saw a rebound. So we saw the Magnificent Seven. I've also seen it called Mama Ant, Mama for the software companies where you have the Microsofts, the Amazons, and then you have the Ant, which is the more hardware, Apple, Nvidia, and Tesla. So those companies had a very good year, but luckily the rest of the market caught up towards the end of the year, and we had a really strong 2023. So Chris, obviously we just finished a very strong 2023. What are some of the things we're looking for in 2024?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've talked about that'll be a fun event is the Olympics upcoming. But as we look beyond the Olympic sphere, right, there are things that are going to be tenuous, and that might include the presidential election here in the US, but also elections overseas. As we think about where the economy is going to be going, there's a great deal of momentum right now, primarily because the corporate sector continues to hold up okay. The consumer sector continues to hold up okay. The labor markets have been strong. Consumers are still spending money. They have an excess of cash and savings from those 2020 and 2021 calendar years. So as we think about the economy, there's still a good deal of momentum coming into this year. But as with everything in recent years, if not recent decades, it's going to boil down to the Federal Reserve and path of interest rates, right? So what we've seen is that the market is telling us the Fed can now begin to cut interest rates. Inflation is under control, so the next step is to cut rates. What the market's telling us, though, is that there may be 6 or 7 interest rate cuts this year, whereas the Federal Reserves themselves, officials at the Federal Reserve have said, no, we're not going to go that far. Maybe we will cut 2 times or 3 times. So there's a pretty large disconnect there that I think needs to be reconciled for this year, because depending on which outcome we get, it's going to have very different ramifications for the economy, but it's also going to have different implications, right? It'll imply we either had a hard economic landing or one that was of the softer variety that we're seeing right now. For better or worse, this year will continue to be an exciting one like we've seen in the last couple of years, and I think there's going to be plenty to discuss as we get together over the next several months.
Chris, thank you very much for that color. We thank you all for joining us for the WealthSpire Winter 2024 Market Recap and Outlook. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to your financial advisor or visit us on the wealthspire.com website. We thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to speaking to you again in a few months.